Welcome back. This is Talking the Whiz Quiz with Lori and Gary Ashman. I am Lori.
And I am Gary.
And today we're going to talk about what needs to happen when an employee violates the drug and alcohol testing regulations. We'll talk about what the employer must do and the steps the employer must take to clear a violation when it comes to federally regulated testing. We will also discuss the FMCSA Clearinghouse and the role it plays with violations and driver qualifications for FMCSA companies. Gary, do you want to get us started with what is a violation?
There's multiple things that are violations. One is, the obvious is, having a positive drug or alcohol test. But there's also refusal to take a test. Pre-duty use of alcohol, which, that length varies by mode, because every mode basically says, hey, you cannot use alcohol within so many hours of reporting to duty. Also, just, even possession or, distribution of alcohol or drugs in the workplace is against the federal regulations. And so there's definitely going to be some reporting requirements, depending on the mode. And then, we're going to talk about, who is required to do that reporting because it does vary by situation.
Okay. And as far as the DOT regulations, when an employee violates the rules, there's essentially some steps that need to happen.
Definitely. And that's one of the things that, from like our previous podcast, we talked about is that you have to immediately remove that employee from safety sensitive functions. And when we say immediately remove, that is pretty much when you get notified this person has violated, they have a positive test, you need to remove them right away. Obviously, if it's like a pilot, you're going to make sure that aircraft lands safely.
I would hope.
But once that is, you have to pull that employee, right away. If there's a co-pilot situation, then obviously if somebody else can take the controls, then. But in the case of like a truck driver, you have to get that truck safely to the side of the road. But it doesn't matter if they're out in the middle of nowhere. They have to get that truck.
You need them to stop immediately
to a safe stopping place. Because obviously you don't want to park in the middle of the interstate, but you definitely need them to pull that over right away. And it doesn't matter that you can't say, hey, we need you to complete your run and then we're going to take you off. No, it is, we're going to remove you.
To stop immediately.
And if that means you got to fly a new driver out to pick up that truck, that is the requirement. Once you have to immediately, because there is a liability if that employee is in an accident and you were aware that they had drugs,
had a violation of some kind.
So
right.
They have to be immediately removed. So once you remove that employee, you then have to give that employee the list of substance abuse professionals, whether you are terminating that employee or not, or you're not going to hire that person. You do need to refer them to a substance abuse professional. There are a list of qualified substance abuse professionals. You should always have a list to know who your SAPs are beforehand, before you ever get into a situation. There are referral companies out there. There are services that you can contract out with, or if you have a local substance abuse professional that you know their qualifications, that they are qualified, but you need to be able to provide the name, the address, the phone number to that person who violated the regulations. And in one hand, you could be handing them the list of substance abuse professionals, and the other hand, handing them their pink slip that they are terminated. But if you do retain that person, then you're also going to have to make sure that they have gone to that substance abuse professional. They are off duty, not performing safety sensitive duties until they had gone through that to the evaluation process. And then that there's going to be a whole step of what the substance abuse professional says is going to be required to bring that person back to work. So it's not going to be, chances are it's not going to be you're going to have them back tomorrow or even next week. Most cases we are generally seeing the substance professionals taking somebody off duty for probably a good 30 days to get through the entire evaluation process and also to deal with any steps to return to work, such as possible education.
And we'll go into more detail here in a little bit on that return to duty process, because there are a lot of critical steps that have to take place, and it has to be done in a particular order in order for it to be done properly per the DOT regulations. So what else does the employer need to do, or what else needs to happen with that violation?
So depending on what mode they are and what occupation that person is in, there may be some mandatory reporting to a DOT agency. For federal motor carrier, that means that it's going to have to get reported to the clearinghouse. And that's the clearinghouse is in effect, it's a website, a database that is administrated by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration.
And again, we'll go into a little bit more detail about the clearinghouse as well later in the podcast.
Exactly. But who has to report that violation is dependent to the clearinghouse. On the clearinghouse, it's dependent on what the violation was. If it was a positive drug test, then the medical review officer is the one who's making the report to the clearinghouse. If it is a refusal to test, then it is the employer's responsibility to report that to the clearinghouse. If it is a positive alcohol test, it is the employer's responsibility to report that to the clearinghouse. Now, something I want to caution here is on alcohol testing is defining what is a positive test. I was actually having a conversation with a client earlier today regarding this, as they had a individual who had a result of between a 0.02 and a 0.039. And they were trying to tell me that was a positive test. Under DOT rules, that is not a positive test and would not get reported to anybody like the clearinghouse. That is a temporary violation that you are required to remove your employee from safety sensitive duties for a period of time, but it is not considered a positive test. So for alcohol, a positive test is a 0.04 or greater reading.
On the confirmation
test.
Because with alcohol tests, there are essentially two tests. There's a screening test, and if it screens above
a 0.02,
then it requires a waiting period and a secondary test, that confirmation test, to be completed. And it's that secondary test that is the final
official
result number.
So that confirmation test result has to be a 0.04 or greater for it to get reported to be considered a positive test.
But again, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be removing that person from duty. It just means that it's not a reportable positive result.
It is that person is removed for a period of time. That period of time varies by mode, but they have to be removed from safety sensitive duties for a period of time. But a 0.04 or greater is what is required to be reported. Now, for Federal Aviation Administration, there is mandatory reporting to the FAA if that donor holds a Part 67 medical certificate. And, the people who hold that Part 67 medical certificate, in large part, are the flight crew, but it's not always the flight crew. I could have somebody in a non-flight crew, position
Role.
that still has a Part 67 certificate. So I know we, as our medical review officer department, has to ask and verify after every positive FAA test is, does this person have a Part 67 medical certificate? Because if they do, our MRO is required to report that to the flight surgeon's office of the FAA. And so there's even additional requirements for somebody with a Part 67 medical certificate to have to come back to work beyond the SAP requirements. But then the FAA does have voluntary reporting for non-Part 67 medical certificate holders. So you're not required to report the violation to the FAA immediately, but you do have the option to report it to the FAA.
Do any of the other modes have any requirements with regards to reporting, or is it primarily the FMCSA and the FAA?
Really, it is primarily the FMCSA and the FAA. Everybody else, really, it just comes up during your audits. But they need to see that you did take those proper actions of removing that employee and giving them that referral over to the substance abuse professional.
And the one thing to note, I'm assuming then that regardless of the mode, there still is a return to duty process if an employee has a violation within that mode.
Yeah. Pretty much almost every mode has the same return to duty requirements. The only one that gets a little bit different is U.S. Coast Guard. And the U.S. Coast Guard technically is not a division of U.S. Department of Transportation. They are regulated by the Department of Homeland Security. Many years ago, they were a division of Department of Transportation, and that's where the regulations came in. And at one point, they were moved to Department of Homeland Security. So they have similar rules. And so there are some, U.S. Coast Guard sometimes has some specialty in there of what is required. And there are times that even though we say there's not mandatory reporting to that agency, there is some confirmation letters that possibly could have to go back to the Coast Guard verifying when somebody's re-credentialing their captain's, crewman's license,
Right.
that there may be some reporting at that point back of whether there were any violations in that period. Now, we also, when we talk about also that there's employers' responsibility in reporting to the clearinghouse, the FMCSA Clearinghouse. In some of those cases where the employer is responsible, they can authorize and delegate it to their consortium TPA to act as an agent to report that into the clearinghouse for them, as long as the designated employer representative of that company is requesting and authorizing the CTPA to do that reporting for them. But one of the main things we really look at is refusals to test,
Right.
because I think we talked about previously what is refusal to test, and on a refusal to test, in most cases, it is the designated employer representative that is making the determination of what a refusal is. It is not the CTPA, it's not the collection site, it's not the other service providers. it is the designated employer representative that is making that determination. And
Based
so,
upon regulations, because there are regulations that are outlined by the DOT of what they deem as
So-
a refusal.
so the US DOT is in each mode is defining this is what a refusal is, but it is the designated employer representative who needs to review the situation that happened and say, yes, I believe this is a refusal to test as
Or
as
no, I
defined,
don't
or I do
believe.
not believe it is. So they need to, we as a CTPA, I need to hear from the designated employer representative of, yes, we are considering this a refusal to test, and could you please report that into the clearinghouse on our behalf? I cannot report a refusal to the clearinghouse unless I hear from the designated employer representative, and I always get from our DERs, I require that to be in writing from them,
Right.
that they are considering this a refusal to test.
Right. So kind of that final piece is when an employer wants to retain an employee, they then are required to follow the return to duty and follow-up process. And that process has been defined by the DOT. Basically, the Department of Transportation has kind of created like a 6-step return to duty process that allows employees to return to safety sensitive functions. And each of these steps, I think I mentioned earlier, they need to be done in order in order to clear that violation. There is a specific order and procedure that takes place. And we're going to go through some of that now. And it starts with that SAP referral.
Yeah, and I think the very important thing to emphasize here is you need to stay in the order that it is, and you cannot jump ahead and
Right.
and get certain pieces done until it is authorized for them to do so. So
Exactly.
that's something I think that, I'll probably will restate it again, but it is one of the common problems that we are seeing, that somebody is trying to jump ahead and get themselves cleared faster by saying, I'll just get this done. But
Right.
they could not do it, because they weren't authorized to do it. Now they're having to repeat that step.
it. And each of these steps can cost money to the driver, to the employer. One thing to remember in this return to duty process is, as an employer, you do not have to necessarily pay for the return to duty process for an employee. You may say, yes, I will take you back, but the cost of any of the testing and requirements will come from the employee. Again, they don't have to pay for it. However, an employer can choose to pay for it.
The DOT is silent on who's responsible for the costs. And in that case, it is the employer can very well, on the entire return duty process, make it the employee's responsibility in order to get their job back or to retain their position that the employee is paying for. But an employer can elect to pay for it themselves too.
Right. I just think it's important that employers know that they are not obligated to pay for it. But in the same as they are not obligated to keep an employee who has violated, or to hire an employee who has violated the regulations, but they have the option to.
Exactly. And I will tell you, more employers than not will not pay for any parts of the return to duty process. It is the employee's responsibility to incur the costs of the program.
And I think that goes to, there is actual um like backing of
Repercussions in effect.
repercussions, and showing that when an employee pays for their process, for their substance abuse process, they tend to take it more seriously and are more likely to come out on the other side.
Very much so, and that's, I mean, I've definitely seen that over the years, that they need to have
Some ownership in it.
yeah, basically some teeth in the game.
Mm-hmm.
That, if somebody else is paying for it, then a lot of times it's like, okay, I'm just going to take advantage of it until I get caught again.
Exactly.
Whereas if it's out of their pocket, there is more likely that they are going to actually do it, take it seriously, and hopefully not reoffend.
Exactly. So as we kind of start with the steps, as I said, the DOT really has outlined a 6-step process. And that first step is the SAP referral. That is when the DER removes that employee from the safety sensitive functions, and they provide that employee with the name and information for an SAP counselor. On the FMCSA clearinghouse, the SAP must be sent, that request is sent through the clearinghouse. Basically, there is a step where that has to be initiated in the clearinghouse.
Really, at that point, basically, is once that person has gone to that first evaluation, the SAP is required to go into the clearinghouse and show that, yes, I have done that first assessment, and basically they are putting their name to this person.
Right, which is that step 2, technically there's a step in between there, because step 2 is where an SAP is designated. That's when that employee selects their SAP counselor and makes that appointment to meet. And in the clearinghouse, in this case for CDL drivers, is they are designating, I am going to be working with this SAP counselor. Then when we get to step 3, that's when that assessment comes into play.
And so one of the things is you can't shop SAPs. Once somebody's referred to them, then that is your SAP. That you maybe initially you could say, okay, here's a couple options, but once that person is referred and they go see an SAP, if they don't like what they hear from the SAP, they can't say, I'm just going to go see a different SAP.
Correct.
They have to stay with that single SAP through the entire process.
Yeah, and with that initial assessment, the employee's going to meet with the SAP counselor. That can be in person. It can also be via phone or video. There are options.
The DOT, especially after COVID, is allowing for virtual SAP meetings, whereas prior to COVID, it always had to be face to face.
Right.
Which one of the nice things about it now being allowed to be virtual is it's a lot easier on especially the people in the rural markets, because an SAP has to meet certain education and certification requirements. Not anybody can just say, I'm an SAP. They
Right.
have to be a registered substance abuse professional who's met certain requirements. And there's not a lot of those really qualified substance abuse professionals out there.
Right.
It really is a very limited number. So even in major cities, sometimes I only find a few SAPs in an entire market. And so because of that, when I have somebody that's in a, especially more rural, they were having to drive sometimes 100 miles several hours to go meet face to face with a substance abuse professional, which is not convenient whatsoever, and really, almost
Prohibited to some people, yeah.
Whereas now that it can be done virtually, it does allow for more options, more convenience to get that person to, return to work.
Right. So once the employee has met with that counselor, the counselor is then going to make their initial assessment, and generally will then provide that employee with a treatment plan. And that treatment could include education, it could include treatment, it could be a combination of both. It really just depends on, through that initial discussion with the employee, is determining what that treatment needs to be. For a lot of people, it's a pretty easy, educational thing. For others, it is a more in-depth. It really just depends on the level of use or abuse that is
how
determined.
Serious a problem what have they determined that person's history is? Where somebody who may have misused a prescription medication may have a smaller, lesser
Might be a 3-hour educational requirement versus...
Whereas somebody who has come out that they've had a problem, a substance abuse problem for years, it's possible they could be required to go to rehabilitation. It's possible it could be an in-house rehabilitation, or maybe it's an outpatient rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. So the amount of time it's going to take somebody to be allowed to come back to work is going to vary by the case and what that substance use professional feels that they, is going to be required for this person. And that substance use professional has some liability on them. Because if something happens and this person reoffends and there's an accident, is somebody going to come back on the substance use professional saying you didn't do your job?
You didn't do enough.
So years ago, there were times I would see somebody allowed to return to work within a day or two of the initial assessment. Whereas it's rare if I ever see that anymore, where it's now usually I see somebody off, probably 3-4 weeks, for most people we see going through the SAP process, and obviously sometimes longer, depending on what some of these next steps are.
Right. And then as the employee is working through that treatment plan, once they've completed whatever that SAP counselor has determined, the SAP counselor will then determine if they are eligible for that return to due process. And that's why we say, don't jump ahead. Don't go take that return to duty test until you have in writing from your SAP counselor that you have been released for that next step, which is step 4.
Exactly. You have to be released to be able to return the duty. So there is usually a second assessment that happens before that. Basically, that second assessment is generally where that next step 4 is that they are going to be allowed to authorized to return to duty.
Right. And only the SAP counselor can make that determination of that eligibility for the return to duty test. Return to duty test basically is once that person has been cleared through the treatment by the SAP counselor, they then can go in for a drug or alcohol test, or both. It really depends on what their particular situation was. And they have to complete this return to duty test. It is a federally regulated test. Drug tests are an observed test where that it has to be an observed test. It has to be marked as a return to duty test. And once you have a negative result back, that's when you can go on to that next step. So in step 4, we're really determining that eligibility, and that comes from the counselor.
Yeah.
And one thing to note on FMCSA Clearinghouse, the SAP counselor has to submit to the clearinghouse that that employee is eligible to take the return to duty test before they take the return to duty test.
And that is something I say you have to pay extra attention to, because trust me, the clearinghouse will flag it and not allow that person to, and they will reject that return to duty test unless they see from the substance use professional that they have been released to return to duty. So
Right.
if you take that return to duty test before you have been, the SAP has released you,
Right.
then that return to duty test that you just paid for is no good. It's
Right.
void because it was done prior to you being released by that substance abuse professional. So the dates and the times matter,
They
because
absolutely matter. We've seen it way too many times where people think that I completed my treatment. Why can't I go take my test? Well, because there are very clear steps, and specifically with the clearinghouse, because everything is recorded in the clearinghouse through this process. It's really important that you are paying attention to make sure that everything has been submitted to the clearinghouse properly, and to not jump ahead or try to do something out of order, because as we said, is you take that test a day early, it's not going to count. So, and that release has to come from the SAP, and it's usually in writing and it is dated.
So one thing I do want to point out, as the DOT has, passed, but they have not cleared for oral fluid testing to happen on Department of Transportation regulated tests, that at this time, only urine testing is allowed, and it has to be a direct observed urine test. Now, what is going to happen is when the Department of Transportation finally does clear the laboratories and certify them for oral fluid testing for DOT purposes, that then it is going to be the requirement is going to be for an oral fluid test for return to duty and for your follow-up tests. Whereas now the only, and they don't want to see urine testing. They want to see oral fluid testing for when a direct observed test is required. But at this time, because there are no laboratories that the DOT has certified, oral fluid testing is not allowed. So that's where a direct observed urine test has to be completed. And I've seen this happen too many times where somebody's gone in for their return duty test or their follow-up test and did not get it observed. And if it was not observed, it can be
Does not count.
It does not count. It could be canceled by the medical review officer because it was not observed.
Right.
So it is the employer's responsibility, not the collector's responsibility. It is the
donor's
responsibility to make sure that on every return to duty and every follow-up test that they make sure that it is observed.
Right. One thing I also want to point out that the DOT does allow is if, as an employer, you are hiring someone who is has a violation and requires this return to duty test, their return to duty test can actually count as your pre-employment test for that employee. Now, a pre-employment test cannot count as a return to duty test, but a return to duty test can count as your pre-employment test. And that is across all modes, but it is so if you're hiring somebody again who has had a violation and is at that step 4 process or place, you can use a single test. You don't have to, the employee doesn't have to submit to 2 tests. Just making sure that return to duty test is that observed
And
test.
And this is a very common thing that we do see, because a lot of times when there was a violation, the person was dismissed from that employer.
Right.
And so when they start going through the substance return to duty process, they're doing this, but it's generally that they are going to end up working for a brand new employer in many, in probably almost a majority of the cases,
Right.
that they were terminated, and now they're trying to find a new employer. And so there's going to be some stuff that we're going to talk about in a few minutes because technically to have a return to duty test, you have to have an employer.
Right.
But there is an exception to that. And especially when we're dealing with the clearinghouse, with the clearinghouse is really where there is the exception for a federal motor carrier, because that is the case that there is a automatic record in the federal system that there was a violation.
Right. And they've created a caveat for employees to get themselves out of prohibited status in order to find a job, because a lot of times, unfortunately, employees, it's difficult to find a job when you are have that violation, active violation. But there are a lot of employers that are willing to take on employees and just ask that they get themselves through that return to duty process. And again, we'll talk more about that when we start talking about the FMCSA Clearinghouse. But step 5 then is that negative return to duty test is completed. Once the return to duty test is provided to the employer, SAP, and authorities as required, the employee may then return to safety sensitive functions at that time. However, the violation is not closed. They have simply gotten themselves through that return to duty piece. So through step 5 is they are now able to work in a safety sensitive role.
So we'll talk about go into a little bit more detail on this, but in a few minutes. But really is those FMCSAs that when that return to duty needs to get entered into the clearinghouse record. But we'll go, there's some special things in that, but we're going to get a little more in depth to the clearinghouse.
Right.
And I think that, we'll talk about that in a couple minutes when we get to that.
So the final step of that return to duty and follow-up process is the actual follow-up testing. And in the case of follow-up testing, the SAP determines what that follow-up plan must be. And it depends primarily on what the specifics of that particular person's treatment and program. It is a minimum of 6 tests over 12 months, but it can be an unlimited number of tests over the course of 5 years. It really just depends on the specific situation of each employee or each person.
So what the substance abuse professional does is they're going to lay out in writing to the employer
Right.
what this follow-up program is. And they're going to say, okay, this person is going to be subject to follow-up testing for this period of time. As as Lori said, it's a minimum of 12 months.
Right.
It is a maximum of 5 years. There is a minimum of 6 tests in that first year. But there is no maximum number of follow-up tests. You think that they would put a cap on it? They do not put a cap on it. And that and it is the substance use professional who makes that determination, and the employer cannot vary off of what the substance abuse professional has said. This is the required number of tests, and this is the time period. Whatever they say goes. And the SAP may lay it out of this is that, in the first 1 month, the first month you do this many tests, and in the first 3 months you do this many tests, or you have 1 test every month for this period of time, then maybe it goes a test every, maybe they'll say, hey, we want to test every other month. But one thing that the substance use professional cannot say is what specific day this person's required to test.
Right.
They basically lay out a schedule of this is how many tests have to get done, and this is the frequency of the testing. But they do not control
the specific
dates of that test.
Right. And one thing to note, you mentioned that the SAP counselor sends that that outline to the employer. The employee themselves should not know and should not be told what that plan includes.
I wouldn't even say should not, cannot.
They cannot be told what that plan includes. Yeah. They cannot know how many tests, how long they have to test, any of that. It's when it comes to implementing this follow-up plan, it really needs to be very random, very on the spot. Now we'll go a little bit more into that, but and the plan may include drugs, it may include alcohol, it may include both. It really, again, depends on the initial assessment and what was specific to that particular employee's situation. The other thing to note, as with the return to duty test, all follow-up drug testing must be observed.
Direct observed for urine. When they do eventually allow for oral fluid testing, oral fluid testing is observed anyway. It's just, it's not going to be where on an observed test for urine, it has to be somebody of the same gender.
Right. Whereas
when we get to oral fluid, it doesn't matter what gender the collector is when we do oral fluid testing.
So, yes. And so the DER will be sending that employee in for their follow-up testing as required by the plan. The key things to remember there, like randoms, when the DER states that you need to go and test, that employee needs to report immediately. That means they stop what they are doing and they go and take that test. Just like with a random test. So, the DER does have some flexibility in selecting a time when it would be more convenient for an employee to report. That, as long as they are staying within the guidelines of that follow-up plan, they can determine what day, what time to send that employee in. As collection sites, I recommend make sure that you are allowing that employee enough time to be able to get to the facility and provide the specimen before that facility close. Don't have that employee show up at the end of the day. Do not, be thoughtful for making sure that that test is completed, because if the test, if the employee is told to take this test and it is not completed, it can be considered a refusal to test.
And two other pieces I think I need to add to that is the DER, when they are trying to schedule this return to duty test or a follow-up test, one, make sure that, well, especially on a follow-up test, that they have at least 3 hours before closing time.
Right.
Because if the person does have a shy bladder, it's a 3 hour window. So do not send somebody in, like I said, again, end of the day, we need to have enough time. Or if you know that they have a hot run, they have to be somewhere, you need to really allow for that 3 hour buffer.
Right.
Just in case there is a shy bladder situation. And then the other thing the DER really needs to do is make sure at the time when we can only do direct observed testing for urine, that the collection site has somebody of the proper gender there before you send your donor to that collection site. Call ahead.
Right.
Because you cannot assume that there is somebody of the right gender there, that because some sites only have, somebody of a single gender there.
Right.
Or just make the assumption that, hey, this collection site always has a male collector there. Well, that male collector may have called in sick today.
Right. Or is out on vacation.
Yeah. So before you send somebody in that day, call ahead before you notify your employee that they have a follow-up test, that there is somebody of the proper gender there that day for them to do that direct observed test.
The other thing with that, we mentioned, make sure you're sending them at least 3 hours before closing time, but also 3 hours before that employee is scheduled to be off shift. So, if they get off work at 3:00 and you send them in at 2:30 and they end up and have a shy bladder, that employee has 3 hours to provide that test. If they leave the facility without providing a specimen, it is considered a refusal to test. Well, if you send them at the end of their shift and they have somewhere else to be after they got off work today, you've created a situation that could result in a refusal to test. So be very thoughtful as you are scheduling these and sending an employee in to make sure that there is adequate enough time for that employee to provide the specimen as required. But again, goes back to, though, when you notify that employee of that test, they need to report immediately. They cannot wait until, after lunch. They can't wait until after their run. They can't wait until the end of the day. They need to go immediately upon being notified of that test.
And one last thing on the follow-up program is, in all cases, for all modes, including FMCSA, to have a follow-up test, that person has to be an employee or in a working for a safety sensitive employer. Right. If it's an owner operator situation, they are, yes, they are both the employer and the employee. But for somebody who has, they were terminated because of the violation, they are now trying to get back to work, FMCSA does have an allowance to get them to take that return to duty test without having an employer.
Right.
But they cannot start or take any follow-up tests when there is no employer, no safety sensitive employer.
Right.
And key there is safety sensitive employer, meaning I'm working in a non-safety sensitive employer right now. While I'm off, yes, maybe I have a job, but because this person is there, because that employer is not regulated by DOT and you're not performing DOT safety sensitive functions for that employer,
Right.
you cannot take any follow-up tests.
Correct. So they need to be actively employed in a safety sensitive role. And the other key point in that is you can't ask them to take this test on their day off, or, they have to be on shift or immediately leading up to their shift or immediately following their shift. Is that?
So, yeah. So the big thing, like I said, you have to make sure you are working for somebody, because that's where we've caught some people. They're like, well, I'm just, hey, I need to show that so I'm just going to complete, I'm not employed by somebody right now, so I'm just going to start taking my follow-up test. That way I can get this thing done. Well,
Right.
One, from an employee standpoint, as we said, you're not allowed to know how many follow-up tests and how frequency they are anyway, so you cannot set your own schedule.
Right.
And you can't even contract us as the CTPA to set that for you. I can't even manage that for you unless you have a DOT employer.
Right.
So yes, that is a stopgap. You need to be in a role, and so yeah, probably maybe I'm overemphasizing it, but I'm not. Because we ran into that situation as a CTPA where somebody's trying to do this, and we're like, yeah, no, you can't. And you're going to have to find an employer who's willing to take you on with your record.
Right. And then they'll say, well, I'm an owner operator. It's like, okay, but are you operating currently?
Yeah.
And that's the other key piece of that is you may own a truck, but if you're not actively working, you are not currently considered currently employed.
And our big question, especially on most of the owner operators are federal motor carrier.
Right.
What's your US DOT number? Because I have to report all this back to a specific US DOT number.
Correct.
To show that this was completed. So unless there's a active US DOT number there, you're not an owner operator.
Right. The other key thing here is through this follow-up process, if the donor tests positive or refuses to take a test, whether it be one of the follow-up tests or a random test, a post-accident test, basically any type of test during this process, it is considered a new violation, and it takes that employee all the way back to step one, where they are removed from duty and they basically are starting all over. So any work that you've done up to that point is no longer counts, and you start all the way over back at step one.
So you're getting a brand new substance abuse professional evaluation.
Right.
And whatever follow-up program they put you on is starting from scratch.
Zero.
It's also going to be a brand new one, because whatever your prior follow-up program was is no longer valid. It is a brand new brand new program.
Right.
And yeah, you're literally starting at zero. And
right. So it's important to know that, through this process, and really drug testing in general, a violation is a violation, and there is a procedure, and each new violation sets you back starting from scratch.
I just had a case probably in the last month or two that we had a gentleman that was on a 5-year plan. He didn't know it, but he was on his very last follow-up test that he needed on this 5-year return to duty plan that we received from the substance use professional, because this person was an owner operator, we as the CTPA was administering the entire follow-up plan for him. And when we sent him in for his very last follow-up test, he tested positive. And guess what? Now he had to go back.
He's starting over.
He had to start over, and he had to go to the substance use professional, and then he's on a brand new 5-year plan. So instead of this being it took him 5 years, now all of a sudden now it's 10 years.
Right. So it is, it's really important. One, to not violate the rules, but two, to make sure that you are, as an employee, doing everything you can to make sure that you are following the plan and doing, taking the tests and going through, all the procedures properly to basically to clear that. Because part of this step 6 then is once that employee has completed all of the required testing, then the employer or a CTPA can then basically certify that they have completed the plan as written, and it will then
or an FMCSA employer, it's then going to get reported into the clearinghouse that this person has completed it.
Right.
So the substance use professional is no longer involved at this point. So the person reporting it that this has been closed out is the employer, or in effect they can have their CTPA report that into the clearinghouse that it is closed out, and basically certify that they have completed the program.
And at which time, for that employee in the FMCSA Clearinghouse, it will show then that that violation is closed. That up to that point, it will still show that they have an open violation, and it will state what step that they are at. But once you have completed and that final test has taken, and the employer reports that it has been complete, the plan has been completed, the violation will then show as closed. It does not remove that violation completely from your record in the clearinghouse, at least not initially, but it will show that it is closed.
Yeah, it will not remove it. It's going to be there for a good period of time.
Right.
It will just show it is closed. Now, one last thing just on this is one question we do get sometimes is there's an employee who's on a follow-up program, and he leaves that employer, and he starts with a brand new employer. Does he have to start that follow-up program from scratch? The answer is no, he does not. The new employer can pick up that follow-up program and keep administering it from wherever the old employer left off at.
Right.
Now, that being said, there's a couple caveats in here, is that one, that new employer needs to be able to get that follow-up program from either the SAP or that initially did it, or they need to be able to get it from the previous employer.
Correct.
And then they need to be able to get the previous employer to release where that person is in the process.
Right. What tests have they already taken, and be able to, the new employer needs to be confident that previous employer is providing proper information.
Exactly. And there are cases, there's no obligation for the previous employer to release the actual drug test results or even tell you where that person was in the process. The requirements basically was that the previous employer has to disclose that, yes, that person, had a violation, and that they had went through a SAP, that they completed the SAP initial assessment, but they do not need to release out exactly where they're at. They don't have to provide copies of the previous results to them. So there could be a documentation issue that if you cannot get the records that you need to show where that person really is at confidently, then that person is in effect is going to have to start that follow-up program from scratch. And even in the FMCSA Clearinghouse, every follow-up test is not reported to the clearinghouse. The only things that are reported to the clearinghouse is the initial violation, then that they have passed that return duty test, and then that it was finally closed out that they took their very last follow-up test.
Right.
Not all the
tests in between are not recorded.
Are not recorded in the clearinghouse at all.
A good practice, best practice for employees in these situations is when they do take a drug or alcohol test, they should be provided at the collection site with a donor copy of that test. They should keep those, hang on to those. That's your record to show, hey, I took these tests. I don't necessarily know what happened with results, but I took these tests. Yeah. That at least a new employer would be able to confidently say, okay, I can assume that, there's no further violations, so these were probably all negative results.
Generally, what an employee has the right, because technically these are medical records, that they can go back to their previous employer and request copies of the results. They can't generally go to the CTPA and request it. It has to come from the employer. But if they request in writing copies of the drug test results, that employer should provide them copies of those results. So, if they're trying to, the biggest problem we run into is when a company is no longer in business.
Right. But again, it's where if an employee can keep whatever records they have, when you're in this program, it is in their best interest to make sure that they are keeping track of what tests that they have taken and how many tests that they have taken. They may not know what is being required of them, but at least they have record of what they have done. And I think now, that's essentially that is the 6 steps. And we've talked a little bit about Clearinghouse. One thing we did, just in general, as we kind of go in deeper about the Clearinghouse, with regards to return to duty process, is when a driver has a violation in the Clearinghouse then shows that driver as being in prohibited status. What that essentially means is that they have a violation and they are currently prohibited from doing any safety sensitive functions until they complete steps 1 through 5 of that SAP return to duty process. And when a violation has not been addressed within approximately 90 days of that violation, the FMCSA requires Department of Motor Vehicles to notify that employee that their CDL license is being revoked and that their driver's license is being downgraded to a regular standard driver's license.
So really what it is once they are reported into prohibited status, it's almost immediate to the DMV, and they are put into a status that their commercial privileges have been removed effective immediately. But then but they really are given 90 days for them to get into see that substitute professional and to get that return to duty test and to be able to get into a non-prohibited state.
Right.
At that point, if they don't see that that's happening, then it becomes more of a revocation of their license, that in a case that and really what's the difference between being put into a prohibited status and having it revoked really is that in prohibited, I don't have to go back to the DMV to get my license commercial privileges reinstated. That I can just, once it's put into the clearinghouse, that the return to duty is there, and it basically, in effect, should remove the prohibited status without any further action at the DMV. But after that 90 days, if it goes into revoked status, now I'm physically going to have to go down to the DMV to get my commercial privileges reinstated.
Right.
I can't just put the result into the clearinghouse to get my license back.
Right.
So that is really the difference between just going to that prohibited to actually having a full revocation of your CDL license.
And it's revocation of your CDL license. And if you get to that point, it's to know that you are not losing your license. You are losing your CDL license. You are downgraded to a standard driver's license.
You've lost your commercial privilege.
Right. You can still drive a car, but you can't drive a commercial vehicle.
So this kind of really gets us into really what is the
clearinghouse?
Really, what is the clearinghouse, and kind of how this has evolved.
Exactly. So really, I mean, the clearinghouse, as we stated earlier, it is a secure online database that gives employers, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, state driver's license agencies, state law enforcement personnel, and it gives them real-time information about commercial driver's license and the commercial learner's permits holders' drug and alcohol program violations. So the clearinghouse contains records of violations of drug and alcohol prohibitions, including positive drug tests, positive alcohol tests, test refusals, all those violations we talked about earlier.
So here, let's kind of give a little history of the clearinghouse and what is it, and why, kind of
right.
the why. Really, you may hear out there Clearinghouse 1 and Clearinghouse 2. Clearinghouse 1 was the initial phase-in of this program that previously, in almost every other mode still requires to do previous employment verifications, including verifications of your drug and alcohol history from that previous employer up to generally a 2-year period. The issue that was, motor carriers were running into is, one, when it came to pre-employment testing, because that person was never an employee, no one ever knew but there was a violation of a pre-employment.
Right.
So what the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration did is they basically put in this central database that employers are required to query, and also that all motor carriers are required to submit information on adverse drug and alcohol testing results. So we're having to report in anytime their drivers or their applicants, tested positive, refused to take a test, or had any other drug and alcohol violations. We're not going to find anything in there about negative drug tests in there. This is only about violations.
Right.
But initially in that Clearinghouse 1 phase, the only place that this really hit was to the employers, that it did not affect somebody's driver's license at that time. that the states were actually given an additional amount of time to get their systems up and running. So Clearinghouse 1 basically took the place of me now having to physically send out to a previous employer,
Right.
if that person has, had a violation. Now, there was a phase-in period that basically, because it only had records from day one of the clearinghouse,
Right.
it did not have the 2 years prior violations, that I still had to send out inquiries to previous employers up to 2 years after implementing into the clearinghouse. Once we pass that 2-year mark, now I can just query
Exclusively use the
clearinghouse, and I do not have to send out a previous notification. Now, Clearinghouse 2, which is the more recent development, is that now the states, DMVs, the motor vehicle departments, are now involved, and that is where all of a sudden now licenses are being,
Downgraded
downgraded or revoked. But this information was not affecting originally into the DMVs. They originally wanted it into the DMVs, but the states said, "Hey, we are not ready. We do not have the system for this. We need a phase-in time," which is why basically the federal government said, "Okay, you have until this date."
I believe it was November 18th of 2024.
So November 18th, 2024. So just over a year ago, that this was now
Right.
is now mandatory. That now, so now a lot, what we were seeing is a lot of people that were reported into the clearinghouse with violations. They were, especially if they were owner operators, they just kept running because they still had their driver's licenses.
Right.
And until they got caught, they were just like, "I'm just going to keep running." But now that it is in, the states are reporting it, and they're now downgrading their licenses. Now, when they go through a weigh station or they get pulled over, and the roadside officer checks their licenses and said, "Hey, you do not have a commercial privileges right now," and they just shut that truck down and just cited them for driving without a commercial driver's license.
Right.
So now there's more teeth. Clearinghouse 2 basically put a lot more teeth into this. So all of a sudden, as a CTPA, all of a sudden, as November of 2024, we started to see a lot more people saying, "Hey, I need to go through my return to duty and go to see the substance abuse professional and be in a follow-up program." There was
Right.
definitely an uptick in the volume of that because now there were some teeth to it because they were losing their licenses.
Right. And the thing to remember with the clearinghouse is, as you said, I mean, this is replacing where employers had to send out inquiries to previous employers of their prospective employees to determine if there were any violations. This is a piece of the driver qualification process. This is not your drug testing program. This is not your random testing program. The clearinghouse is determining the eligibility of a driver. It is not testing them for drugs. It is...
Exactly. The clearinghouse is a database.
It's a database.
It is plain and simple a database of is this person prohibited or is this person not prohibited? The testing is not happening here. They are not administering a random program. They are not making sure you have pre-employments. This is one small aspect of your overall DOT drug testing program.
Right. And really it's part of that driver qualification file.
Exactly.
It's the steps that you have to put into place to make sure that this person is qualified to work for you, has all the qualifications. And if they have a prohibited status, they are not qualified for your program, or for, to be working in that role at that time. The thing that the FMCSA Clearinghouse is not is it is not your drug testing program. It is not a random consortium. It is not a random testing program. And the thing to remember is when you are signing up for a drug testing program or signing up for a consortium, those are not the clearinghouse. They are two separate entities and are handled differently. So when you sign up for a consortium, unless that consortium is specifically stating that they are providing specific clearinghouse functions, the consortium does not have anything to do with the clearinghouse, and your consortium provider is not providing clearinghouse services unless they are specifically stated in your agreement with them.
And even so, the deal FMCSA has limited what a CTPA can do.
Right.
And you as a company, as a motor carrier, have to go in when you're registering for the clearinghouse. You have to designate your consortium, who your CTPA is. And you can not designate anybody at all.
Right.
There's not a requirement that you designate somebody, but your CTPA, your consortium, does not have any visibility of any of your records and cannot do any reporting on your behalf unless they are designated by the employer as the CTPA for that specific employer.
And even as the CTPA in the clearinghouse, it's limited what that CTPA can see and can do. Yeah. If you have run previous queries, the CTPA cannot see those queries. The CTPA can only see queries that they have ran. They can't see what somebody else has ran on your behalf. So we're not, as a CTPA, you're not getting that full visibility of the company's information.
And one of the big things we'll talk about is, as we get into talking about queries, is that a CTPA cannot purchase query credits on behalf of that employer,
company,
that carrier. This is something, it's actually something that we get brought up in the industry. And I was at a conference with, one of the heads of the FMCSA drug and alcohol testing program. And as CTPAs, we were asking him, why do you not allow us to do that? Because it would be very beneficial for us to be able to purchase query credits for our clients, to be able to do some of the functions that we really need to be able to have, especially with owner-operators.
Exactly.
And they actually felt there was not a priority at that time. And
general consensus of the room was it was.
I actually stood up and asked a question. I said, okay, so is a CTPA responsible for this? Yes. And so the CTPA in that case needs to order the queries? Yes, they do. And so if I'm responsible for ordering that query on that owner operator, I need to be able to, so that's a reason I need to be able to purchase the query credits. And I think we started to see a little light bulb over their heads. I don't know. We'll see how far that goes. But basically, the entire room of probably at least 100 people in that room basically very unanimously said to the gentleman from FMCSA, the industry needs to be able, the CTPAs need to be able to purchase
Right.
query credits. But at this time, as of today, that is not allowed, and I have not heard that it is something that will be in the near future.
Exactly. So, as we are talking about the clearinghouse, there are a number of people who must register and or access the FMCSA clearinghouse. The first of that is CDL drivers. A driver that has registered in the clearinghouse will be able to access their own information, which can be very helpful when it comes to understanding their own, where they're at in a process, specifically if there have been violations. And I've even had spoken with drivers who didn't know that there had been a violation reported on them from a past employer or something, that somehow something got reported and they didn't have any idea that they had been.
They just got notification that their license was suspended, and
Exactly.
they did not know why it was.
Right. So we had to do a little bit of digging. So it's important that drivers get themselves registered, and they can go in and check their own status and know where where they are at.
Who reported? What was the violation that was reported?
Exactly. Secondly is employers. Obviously, employers do need to it's motor carriers or any employer that employs a driver operating commercial motor vehicles, and that they need to be registered in that. Also, consortiums, third-party administrators.
For you to designate me as your consortium TPA, I have to be registered as a consortium TPA in the system for us to come up.
Exactly. Also, medical review officers, and as we were talking in the return to duty process, substance abuse professionals have to be registered in the clearinghouse. In order for any of those people to be able to make any reports or queries or anything, you have to have that access. So it's important that they have that you are registered.
So
that being said, as we've talked about, the law enforcement and state licensing agencies and the FMCSA, they have accessibility into that database as well.
Exactly. Now, one thing I do want to kind of just go back on is on the CDL drivers themselves. The importance of registering in it is that for an employer to run a query on you, now, if you're an existing employee of that company and we're just having to run, we'll talk about where we have to run an annual query.
Mm-hmm.
If the driver was not registered in the clearinghouse, I could still run what's called a limited query on that driver.
Right.
As an employer, but if I am now going, I'm changing as a driver. I'm changing employers. I want to go find a new job.
Right.
At that case, the employer is required what's called run a full query on you, and for them to run a full query on you, the driver has to be registered in the clearinghouse and then give their consent for that employer to run, that specific employer to run a full query on them. So the key there is, if you're looking to change jobs, you better be registered in the clearinghouse, and then you also are still going to have to then give consent,
right,
for an employer. And then also in the case that if there was a violation, even if you haven't changed jobs, but if there's a violation and the employer needs to run your existing employer needs to run a full query on you, it is required that you as a driver are registered in the clearinghouse for them to run that full query.
Right.
So it's a good practice for as a driver to always be registered in the clearinghouse. But yes, there are some drivers who are, just because they haven't changed jobs, they're not registered.
Right. And that's part of that not being registered for people who maybe have been with a company for a longer period of time is because the clearinghouse was started in January of 2020. It's relatively new yet. And that grandfathered in piece of employees that were employed prior to that date didn't have to necessarily be registered at that time. So, and a employer can run limited queries, which they are required to do on an annual basis on all active employees. They can run that without the employee being registered in the clearinghouse.
Yeah, the employees, the drivers still have to give consent, but that can be written consent. It does not have to be registered into, they don't have to be registered in the clearinghouse. That I can hand all my drivers a consent form and say, please sign this, giving your consent for me to run a limited query on you.
Right. So,
which kind of gets us into our employer obligations.
Exactly. The biggest thing there is number one, that employer, you need to be registered in the clearinghouse. And with that, it's tied to your DOT number, to your US DOT number. And you can have multiple people within your company that are part of your company that are active and able to log in on behalf of your company, but the company itself does have to be registered.
And one of the things you're going to find, and this is why part of the reason we, as a CTPA, have some restrictions too, is because of the technology. There's the two-factor authentication, which also requires you to have a login.gov account that's tied to your carrier's motor record. That for us to be able to for somebody to be able to go in and log in to the clearinghouse from the employer standpoint, or even to register themselves as it's going to go back to whose account is your US DOT number under.
Right.
And it's, and as part of that registration, it's going to send a multi-factor authentication request to that authorized contact for that company, which is generally the designated employer representative of the company. Sometimes it's not, but most of the time it's that DER, that for somebody to be authorized to be able to log into the system or to be able to register the company into the system. So which also restricts the CTPA from being able to do it, because they need to have that two-factor authentication to be able to get into there.
Second thing that is required by an employer is to report drug or alcohol program violations. And that includes, as we mentioned earlier, a medical review officer is going to be submitting most positive drug test results. That is one of their obligations. But as the employer, you are required to report any alcohol violations of a concentration of 0.04 or greater. You're going to be required to report a CDL driver refusal to submit for a drug test or alcohol test.
Yeah, and there's a couple exceptions to that where the MRO is the one who makes the determination of refusal in a couple limited cases.
Right.
And in those couple cases, then it will be the MRO who will report it to the clearinghouse. But the majority of refusals are required to be reported by the employer, which technically would be the designated employer representative.
Exactly. You're required to report any actual knowledge as defined in section 382.107. You're also, as we were talking about the return to duty process, you're required to report negative return to duty test results. You also are required to report the date that the driver successfully completes the follow-up testing plan as ordered by the substance abuse professional when that is applicable. Do you want to talk a little bit about the queries?
Yeah. So also, so one of the other big requirements we've kind of referred to is that the employer is required to conduct queries. And basically, there are two types of queries. There's a full query and a limited query. And as we kind of said, the limited query basically is really going to say, hey, there's a violation in the system or there's not a violation in the system.
Right.
Whereas a full query is going to determine, it's basically going to give you the details of what that violation was and really who reported it into it.
Right.
So anytime you are hiring a brand new driver, you're required to run a full query on all your pre-employment before that person ever starts to work for you. So it's kind of that you are required to both get a negative drug test result in your hand, and you're required to have the results of a full query. And as we kind of said, that driver applicant is required to be registered with the clearinghouse and consent for you to run that full query.
A good best practice on that is to make sure, as the employer, verify that employee is registered in the clearinghouse so that it doesn't hold up that process. Because when you submit for that full query, it is sending an email out to that employee to provide consent. If they're not registered, then they also have to get registered and then to be able to provide that consent. Yeah. So it just to help expedite that process.
It's always best to ask your new applicant, are you registered into the clearinghouse?
Right.
And please expect that you will be getting a request to consent for us to run a full query on you. But basically, a query checks, that a current or prospective employee are not prohibited from performing safety-sensitive functions, such as operating a commercial motor vehicle due to an unresolved drug and alcohol testing violation. Basically that violation which a driver has not completed the return duty process. So you're going to basically be able to see, one is if there was a violation that was ever been reported, are they in a prohibited status? And then if they are, if there was, and have they completed that the entire follow-up program?
Right.
yet?
Basically, do they have an open follow-up plan that has not been
Again, a limited query is basically going to tell you there is, either that they are
there's an
not
open violation.
That either it's basically going to say either not prohibited or that there is a open violation. Please run a full query on.
Right.
You're going to be required to run a full query on that driver.
Right.
And if you have an existing employees that you need to, where there's an annual requirement that you do run an annual query on all of your CDL licensed drivers, just to ensure that, yes, maybe they have worked for you for years. You would think that you would know all their violations, but what if they decided to do an extra job, do some side work for somebody,
right?
Took a second job, or maybe they went and said, hey, I'm going to go leave. They're planning on leaving you. I went, as a driver, and I took a pre-employment drug test for another employer, tested positive.
Right.
So I said, I tested positive. I better not quit I better not quit my existing company.
Exactly.
So, but there's now a violation out there. So that's why the FMCSA has mandated annual queries, for all of your existing employees. Now, from a standpoint, is you can either stagger your annual queries throughout the year, we'll just say to the anniversary date of when that person started with you, or you can run them all at one time, which I find is the best practice, is to set a day every year in your calendar that you have a reminder that I'm going to run the queries for all my drivers on this day, no matter when they were hired.
Right.
Because if not, now I have to track the hire dates of everybody to now I'm like, okay, now I got to run a query on this person, annual query on this person. Now I got to run one on this person. Best practice just to get them all, get them all lined up and just run them all same day. Right. every year.
And one nice thing about the clearinghouse, they have created a function where you can upload a spreadsheet of all of your employees and their information at one time. Yeah. And it's very quick, very easy, and sends you all those results out. Yeah. So it's not like it's going to take you a long time. It takes you more if you're doing it over the course of throughout the year. It's going to take you longer doing them one at a time than if you can take that whole list and just submit them.
Yeah. If I have to hand key every one of them in, that's going to be a lengthy process. Where if I can throw them all into, a comma separated value CSV file, almost an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And just upload them all at one time. Because the result I'm going to get is strictly prohibited and not prohibited, or you need to,
right,
or I need you to run a full query on this person. So a company must purchase the query credits. So in their they run $1.25 each at this time to run a query. Again, the employer is the one who's responsible for buying the queries. You can buy as many or as few as you want. I could buy one at a time. I could buy 1,000 at a time,
right,
or more. And they just sit in your account until you use them. But if I all of a sudden have, but one thing good to know is that, say I run a limited query on somebody and it comes back saying you need to run a full query. As long as I can go in there and hit run a full query, within so many days, I think I'm trying to remember what it is, like 5 off. I think it's like 5 days off the top of my head. That if I run that full query within a
short window of
time, I do not get charged to run an extra query.
That's nice.
I've only had to pay for that original query on that driver. They don't double charge me. But again, like I said, the query is required to be conducted as part of a pre-employment driver investigation and also annually on each of your drivers.
Right.
And failure to comply is, the DOT is citing and fining companies for not, for either failing to register, failing to do to conduct their pre-employment queries, or to conduct their annual queries. So during an audit, I was looking at what's happened in 2025, and just pulled a few examples here. That there was a carrier out in Texas that failed to conduct both pre-employment queries and also to run their annual queries. They got fined $5,540. Another carrier out in Massachusetts had failed to conduct a pre-employment query. They got fined $2,050. Same thing as another company, another carrier out in Georgia. They failed to register for the clearinghouse. They got fined $2,050. Somebody else had failed to register out in Georgia. It was about $1,840. So, and then like another one out in California, about $2,050. Now, how are the size of penalties determined? It really is that one, the USDOT is looking at the size of your company, and they're looking at your gross revenues. that, when they're doing an audit of your company, they're actually asking for financials of the company. What is the company's gross revenue? And some of what they're making their determination of how much they can fine you on is, how much money you're making. And then also some of it too is then if somebody, that all the stuff can be, goes through an administrative process, with the judge, that, can I just, they can give me a proposed penalty. Can I challenge it at all? I have the ability to challenge it as a carrier and maybe argue it down a little bit.
Right.
If I can make a good enough case to reduce the penalties. So there are factors that do of what, of why maybe some of those, penalties that I talked about as examples, why some of them vary for the same exact violation. I can't, just as somebody looking at the records, I can't always see everything that determined the full detail of it, just really what the violation was. And generally I can look at the size of that company. Most of these were pretty small, owner operator, or, probably under 5 employee companies that were getting cited, that we were seeing the, roughly that little over $2,000 violation for. But for a small owner operator,
That's real money.
that's if I had to go pay a $2,000, over $2,000 fine, that's gonna be pretty hurtful to my pocket.
And these are just the clearinghouse fines. Chances
Exactly.
are there were other violations, because if you're not aware that you need to be doing these clearinghouse items, you may have missed other requirements and regulations. So
Technically, the US DOT can fine you $10,000 per day per violation that they found. So the maximum is 10,000 per day per violation. So if you have multiple things that you were in violation of,
right.
and then how many days were you out of compliance? Now, how often do I ever see anybody getting fined that heavily? It's rare, if ever. But the fines we do see are still, I've seen fines out there for companies that are tens of thousands of dollars.
Right. And for a small company, that can literally put you out of business. So it's really important that you understand what the regulations are, what your obligations and requirements are, and that you're doing it.
And honestly, for a company to register for the clearinghouse, there is no cost for them to register themselves for the clearinghouse. Now, can they go hire? Are there companies out there that will register you for you? Yeah, there are, and they're going to charge you, and you still are going to be involved in it because of that 2-factor authentication process that's in there. That, yes, can somebody assist you in registering? Yes, they can. If they tell you they can do the whole thing for you, I question that. But the bottom line is yes, can you, as a company, can you register yourself? And there's instructions online in the clearinghouse website of how to do it, tutorials there how to do so. And then, as we said, the cost to run a query is $1.25.
Right.
So it's a pretty low amount that you are looking to hire a driver. It's costing you $1.25, and it's costing you $1.25 per driver you have on an annual basis to run your queries. So that is significantly cheaper than
a $2,000
fine.
The other thing really to remember on this is, yes, you can hire companies to assist you with your clearinghouse obligations. You can hire a company to assist you with your drug testing obligations. All that being said, at the end of the day, it is the company's responsibility to make sure that everything is being done correctly. So at the auditor doesn't care if your vendor didn't do something for you that you were required to do. Because at the end of the day, it is the company's responsibility to make sure that those things are completed. Now, as CTPAs, as company that, that our clients are hiring to assist, we do our best to make sure that you are in compliance, but we cannot do everything for you. And in some cases, we don't have full knowledge of all of your operations to be able to make sure that everything is completed correctly. So it is important as an employer to be involved. Don't just say, well, I handed that over to this other company to run that for me. No, you have an obligation to make sure that things are being done and done correctly.
So, from a best practice standpoint, that the designated employer representative should familiarize themselves with the clearinghouse, and they should be signing in regularly to confirm the company and driver status. Because also if you do not access your account on a regular basis, you may get locked out and have to go back to the clearinghouse administrator and say, hey, please reactivate me. And then generally, if
we've even seen that if extensive periods of time, they will close the account.
Yeah, usually after 2 years, if they see no activity, no one signing in, the FMCSA will close your account and you will have to start from scratch.
Right.
So please make sure you're going in and and at least you're signing in minimum once a year, if not more frequently. For an owner operator, really it is probably a once a year deal.
And even then, you may be locked out each time that you want to log in. You're going to have to call the clearinghouse to have them unlock your account. We've seen it happen. It's something it's a frustration that we all have, that why they lock people out so quickly. Because again, I think that they think that people are hiring all the time and are in there a lot, but especially on the smaller company side, you're not, you may hire one employee a year, if even, and that you're not going into the clearinghouse as often. But it is important that you do go in, just make sure everything is looking right, that there isn't anything that's red flagging for you.
So and then like I said, obviously make sure you're running your queries, conducting that full query on all new hires at the time of the job offer. You want to know this as soon as possible if there's a violation, if there is a restriction.
And the regulation states that person cannot begin a safety sensitive role until you have a clear query.
And then, like I said, when submitting a full query, the driver must be registered in a clearinghouse. They must provide consent for that query, and that system will send them a email to provide consent. So it is best that that applicant you let that applicant know that this is going to be happening, so that they can provide that consent as soon as possible, because that is holding them up from
beginning their job.
And until they do it, now as an employer, I may have an open truck waiting to be filled, but I'm waiting on both the query to come back because I'm waiting for the consent from the driver, and I'm waiting on that negative drug test result.
Right.
And it's costing me money to sit that truck until both of those pieces have been completed. So it is in my best interest to make sure that new hire applicant has consented to the query.
Right.
As I said, the registration, the driver registration is not required for a company to conduct a limited query. And it's best to pick, like I said, an arbitrary date to conduct an annual query on all active employees to ensure you do not miss anyone each year. Now, another best practice is if I do have somebody that has a violation, now that driver has taken their return to duty test before putting that person back to work, even though we entered that person into the clearinghouse, is run another query on that driver to make sure that they are no longer in a non-prohibited state. Because I have seen that happen, that yes, we've submitted something to the FMCSA Clearinghouse saying, hey, this person, but the clearinghouse is still having to review that data. And if they see something, such as the example we gave earlier, that somebody took their return to duty before the substance professional stated that they were allowed to return to work, that return to duty is going to get rejected. And now that driver is still in a non-prohibited status, is still in a prohibited status.
Right.
I want to make sure as an employer that I'm running an extra query and verifying that they are now in a non-prohibited status before I ever put them to work, because we've caught a couple carriers that failed to do that. Then that driver got pulled over on a roadside inspection, and that truck was just red flagged for having a prohibited driver operating it. And that company may have now that may cause a audit of that company. It may cause a fine to be generated for allowing a driver to be operating a commercial vehicle while they were in a prohibited state. Mm-hmm. So best practice is when you report a return to duty to the clearinghouse is to then run an extra query.
Right.
That
$1.25 is a whole lot cheaper than putting a truck out of service or a potential fine down the line. So definitely, it doesn't hurt to run those queries, especially in those situations. Anytime you are reporting something to the clearinghouse, follow that, reporting up with a query just to make sure that it registered properly. As we kind of finish up here, we talked about, the CTPAs and their role with the clearinghouse, that, as a company, you can designate a CTPA and or hire a CTPA to assist with your clearinghouse obligations. Couple things to remember is that ultimately it is the responsibility of the company to make sure that these things are done, and make sure that you understand if you are hiring somebody to assist with this, make sure you understand what that looks like. We've had lots of companies that are like, oh, well, I joined your consortium. I thought you were handling my and I designated you as my CTPA in the clearinghouse. I thought you were handling that. That is not always the case. Make sure that you have a true understanding with your CTPA of what they are providing for you when it comes to the clearinghouse.
Yeah. And as we said, there are restrictions, that CTPA cannot purchase query credits. They can run queries for you, but they cannot purchase the credits to do so.
Right.
And like I said, they do have limited visibility of what they can see. CTPA has limited visibility of what they can see. And if you do make any changes, in your CTPAs, you need to go back in the clearinghouse and, and update who your registered CTPA is. Or I have clients that didn't designate us as their CTPA, and they're like, hey, can you report this for me? Can you do this for me? And I'm like, I have no visibility. I cannot even see your company because you have not designated us as your CTPA.
The other key there is you can only designate a single CTPA. So you can't be working with multiple companies to provide those duties. Generally speaking, if you're going to designate a CTPA, it is going to be the same company that is assisting you with your drug and alcohol testing, because there are related factors when it comes to the reporting side of it. But you can't be working with one company for some drug testing related things and a different company for another and have them both designated. You can only have that single company having access to your company within the clearinghouse.
And if you are an owner operator, you must designate a CTPA in the clearinghouse, because as we've talked about on previous podcast, that the CTPA acts as the DER for an owner operator.
Right.
So because of that, it's important that you designate your CTPA as, in the clearinghouse as your CTPA, because they need to be able to access your records. They need to be able to run queries for you. So it is, and an owner operator is still required to run a full query and annual query.
Right. It's and again, I mentioned earlier, that it seems like you would know if there was a violation in the system, but you don't always know. So it seems counterintuitive that you would need to run a query on yourself that you should know, but you don't always know. So it is important that you are always checking that to make sure that something wasn't mistakenly submitted for somebody saying it was you when it was was maybe another person's violation. Lots of different factors that could go into that. It's just important that, and the DOT is requiring owner operators to still run those queries. As we've kind of wrap up here, is the return to duty process is there's a lot that goes into it, and specifically with the clearinghouse, there are very specific things that need to happen, and hopefully we've provided you a lot of information today with regards to that.
But one of the things that, should a driver find a violation in there that they do not believe is theirs, they can challenge a violation into the clearinghouse. And if they challenge it, basically a notification is going to be sent to the person that entered the information into the clearinghouse, and all the other parties involved, possibly to the MRO, possibly to the CTPA, asking for verification of the violation, including any documentation regarding that. Because we've had, especially when it comes to a refusal to test, where somebody said, I never refused to take a test. Well, here's all the documentation for that that we received from the collection site, and here's the determination that here's where we have in writing from the DER that they made the determination that this was a refusal to test. So I've had to provide to the clearinghouse agents before on a challenge of, okay, this is why this was reported as a refusal to test.
Right. And that's also where, as companies, as DERs, as CTPAs, it is important to make sure that you are documenting all of these violation situations, so that if down the line questions come up, you have the documentation in place to be able to show why something was done the way that it was, or why it was reported. All the details are important.
So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you join us on our next episode.